Coming up on this week's show, the portable GameCube is real.
The Sonic 2 movie trailer lands.
We chat Star Control to Star Wars with Robert Leyland.
The Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every Friday with our good friends at Bitmap Books. Now, one of their books we recommend you check out, and actually we featured this on the podcast before, The Secret History of Mac Gaming. The new expanded edition, reprints are due next month, exploring the Mac's overlooked legacy as a gaming platform. You can check that out and the rest of their retro gaming books at bitmapbooks.co.uk. And with our friends at PCBWay, who offer a fully featured custom PCB prototype service with low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and they do 3D printing and injection molding. And they're big supporters of the retro community. Get a quote for your project right now at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 318, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to this week's show, the podcast that each and every Friday takes you on a journey into the world of classic video games. And of course, the main thing is we keep you up to date on all the big stories that have been happening in the world of retro gaming and tech over the last week. And we're joined by a veteran of the industry on each week's show. Now, we'll talk more about our incredible guest that's coming up on this week's show in just a minute. It was quite nice, though, and I know we say this a lot, but it does kind of blow my mind just how much bigger retro seems to be getting like every few months. I mean, there's these stories coming out and it's getting more and more coverage. You're seeing it on, television now. And actually it was quite nice to get tagged by quite a lot of people on Twitter and Facebook, following on from the episode we did a couple of weeks ago, all about the comeback of retro gaming magazines. We talked about Sega Powered and Amiga Addict. And then actually a week later, The Guardian did an entire feature about it last week.
Yeah, it was a really nice feature, actually, written by Keith Stewart. And I love Keith's stuff. It's always really well thought out and intelligent. And he was talking about the kind of the way that magazines are physical, and people have missed that physicality and that kind of escape that you get with magazines. And there's a lot of nostalgia there. And he was kind of talking about the new magazines that were hitting, and of course he mentioned Amiga Addict, which I'm part of, so I'm going to be biased in that way. But there's some awesome ones as well out there. So there's Retro Gamer as well. There's Zap. There's loads on the shelves, actually, in W.H. Smith and stuff. I went in there the other day and I was like, oh, God, which one do I pick to actually read?
I'm excited about that because we did mention in the interview that we did that Amiga Addict is now going to be in W.H. Smith, which, for people outside the UK, W.H. Smith is like the main high street news agent here. And it's where I used to buy all my gaming mags from when I was a kid and a teenager. So seeing an Amiga magazine back in there, I imagine, next to stuff like Retro Gamer on the shelf, is going to be pretty amazing. It's going to make me feel like I'm 13 again, I think, seeing that.
To me, it feels different than something digital if you can actually buy it from a shop and pick it up and, feel it and go to the reception and be like, oh, could I get this mag, please? It's brings back a lot of nostalgia and kind of warm feelings for us retro gaming fans.
You know what we need next?
What?
Retro Hour audio cassettes on the shelves of WH.
Audio cassettes, wow. That's going to be tough.
What about that? So yeah, congrats to the Amiga Addict gang, which I know you're part of, Rav. It's going to be amazing to see an Amiga mag back on the high street again. So we'll link up that article in The Guardian if you want to check that out. The return of retro gaming video game magazines, following on from that podcast that we did a couple of weeks ago. But this week we have got an amazing guest. Now, you guys did this one, Robert Leyland, and we were trying to kind of summarize what you guys talked about in this interview. And you covered quite a lot in an hour, I think it's fair to say, with Robert.
I'll start with the first half because me and Joe did this one, and God, Robert has done so much stuff. It's another guest where we've had to have a second interview or a second part to follow this on, because even in that interview he revealed what else he did. So for a start, he was talking about Epics and when it was Automated Simulations, which was a kind of early company before Epics, and then he was talking about ZX Spectrum development, Apple II, C64 stuff, a series Star Control. We covered that, and Star Control 2. But then he worked for a graphics company that were also creating the Koala Pad, which was, one of the first kind of graphics tablets that were available. And a lot of people owe their career to that. And then he went on to kind of development with the consoles, didn't he, Joe?
Yeah, like you say, we get a lot of our information, what's just on the website and stuff on the internet. And obviously, there was a big 10-year gap, and that's when he kind of did the koala pad and stuff. So it was really cool that he filled in the gaps. But then, like you say, we then went into the console stuff, and we got a really kind of in-depth kind of perspective of development on the Sega Saturn, which was
not
really
heard
cool,
about that before.
Which we've not heard about. And
Saturn.
you hear a lot of stories about the Saturn and stuff, but he had some really positive things to say about it, because obviously a lot of people tend to hate on the Saturn and stuff and the development on it and how difficult it was with the two processors and stuff. But, he was actually quite a bit of a fan of it. He said it was actually really powerful for what it did and stuff like that. And then we got some really cool inside stories about a lot of the licensed games he worked on, like Congo, and then Star Wars, The Phantom Menace, which was really cool, and how that kind of came about, in the late 90s, with the revival of Star Wars and how it was going to be huge. And then we also spoke about Simpsons Wrestling as well, and, kind of nice. The movie studios and stuff, getting involved and what they could and couldn't do. So it was really cool to get that perspective. But like you say, a really big career from the early 80s all the way up. He's still going. We ended around 2000, 2001. We are the retro hour, as I always say. And he was like, I've got, the original Xbox to talk about and the Wii. And he did all the Skylanders games, with Spyro and stuff. So we definitely got to get him back on again in the future.
And he was part of a subsidiary, which was called Toys for Bob as well. So he started working with them. And they were part of Crystal Dynamics as well, who did Pandemonium and stuff. And there was Saturn development on that. And Activision as well. But then at the very end of it, he just goes, "Oh yeah, but did the Game Genie as well."
Yeah, what? Yeah, he helped with a lot of the programming on the Game Genie, didn't he? So yeah, we only managed to touch on that for literally 2 minutes because it was so vast. So yeah, really, really awesome score there, Avi.
I love the fact that when we're getting a massive guest like that who mentions something as a little throwaway line that could probably be an entire episode.
Yeah,
of its own.
100%. Yeah.
And it's going to be nice to get some Saturn insider knowledge as well, because I think, so we've all got Saturns, haven't we? I know you're a big fan, Joe. I've had a Saturn for years. I remember trying to mod chip Ravi's when he first got his a few years ago. And it is, I think, I know you're a big fan of it, but generally, in terms of retro gaming fans, I do feel it's often quite a bit underrated.
Yeah, massively. And I don't want to spoil the interview, but, he was talking about how the Saturn could do, in his opinion, it could do certain things much better than the PlayStation, but then the PlayStation would just blow it out the water and other things, in terms of polygons and, drawing and rendering polygons and stuff like that. So, it was nice to hear, like I say, that positivity around it,
And the inside story of the development system as well, because we always hear how big the PlayStation development system was when you hear about the Saturn.
He did talk about how when they sent them the Sega Saturn development machine, which I've never even heard about before. So it was really cool. It was very unexpected, which to get all that kind of insider stuff. So definitely one to not miss.
It's a jam-packed interview, isn't it, this one?
And being our resident, hardcore Sega fan, Joe, we had to get you on this interview.
Oh,
so
God,
Robert Leyland,
100%.
He's coming up on the show in around 25 minutes from now. Now, being our resident Sega fan, you think you'd have seen the Sonic movie when that came out last summer.
Are you dropping me in it, Dan? So, story time. We obviously, I love Sonic, and we spoke about Sonic, Sonic 2 in the past coming out, and obviously Sonic 1 a couple of summers ago. But Dan kind of dropped me in it when the first Sonic 2 trailer came out and was like, "You loved the first Sonic, didn't you, Joe?" And I was like, "Mm-hmm. I've not seen it yet."
God, even I sat down and watched 20 minutes of it until I gave up.
I know. I need to watch it. And I have heard a lot of good things about it. I know, Ravi, you're not convinced. I have heard good things about it. So I do need to sit down and watch it, especially with it being on the UK Netflix now. So
I remember me and you were going to go to the cinema and see it together. I don't know what happened. Maybe COVID, another lockdown or something happened. I can't remember. I remember we had plans to, though.
Yeah, we had plans to. I think because of COVID, didn't it end up being the biggest film of 2020 or something?
Yeah, but, I think you might be right.
Yeah, the Sonic 2 trailer is here, and I love the look of it, but my first... I mean, I know, Ravi, I know you've straight away to us said you're not convinced again, but my first kind of opinion of it is it just looks like Sonic 3, the game. Because obviously you've got Knuckles in there, and there's a reveal in it of the big, ginormous Robotnik robot, which looks, obviously there is a giant Robotnik robot at the end of Sonic 2, but I think it looks more like the one at the end of Sonic 3 to me. And there's a whole snowboarding scene in the ice as well, which happens in Sonic 3.
So Tails in there as well, isn't there? Which is a new addition this time.
Yeah. So he was in the after credit scene of the first film. You see, I know these things.
And he looks very cute as well. Tails does compared to Sonic, who's a bit of a kind of like little brat. Tails is like the little kind of cute side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it looks really cool, and I think a lot of the enemies in the in the film and the trailer and stuff like that look just like the enemies from the games. They've really captured the essence of Sonic 2 and Sonic 3, and they've got the the little plane that Tails drives as well. So it looks like the last couple of levels of Sonic 2, which I think is really awesome. And obviously, like I say, you've got Knuckles in there, so it seems like a bit of a Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 based on. But what I absolutely love, which I did post on our socials yesterday, is the poster that they've done for it.
So you got to talk about this. I mean, this is, if you're a fan of the original Sonic 2 game on the Mega Drive, they've pretty much recreated the poster, haven't they? From the game box art.
Yeah, so they've got Robotnik in the background holding the big 2, and it's the exact same
Jim
2.
Carrey.
And it's the Jim Carrey. It's the exact same number 2 with the checkered kind of back to it as the original box art. The only thing where I think they missed a trick is Sonic and Tails on the front cover are kind of ready to fight, like they've got their fists clenched, ready to go. Whereas in the original, Genesis Mega Drive box art, they're stood with their arms folded, that kind of tubular.
I thought they would have gone more literal, maybe the aquatic run in there, or Sonic in Vegas Casino Zone.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe they do when the film comes out. Like I say, it looks as though they've got the last kind of 2 levels of Sonic 2 with the big. I can't remember the name of it, the Death Egg.
The plane in there as well.
Yeah, they've got that level with the plane, and then they've seemed to have got the ice level from Sonic 3, so maybe there will be more of that, when the film actually comes out, and a little bit more kind of based on the game, which would be really cool. But I'm going to make it my mission to watch the first one now. So I can't. I feel like we're going to get so many people hating on me now.
I feel betrayed, Joe.
I know,
including me.
I know.
I'm hating on you, Joe.
I've seen more Sonic than you.
Honestly, I'll sit down and watch it with my daughter. I swear to God, I will.
Well, this is coming out on Sonic 2 premiere on April the 8th in cinemas. So I'm going to drag it to cinema to see this one, but you have to watch the first one.
Of course. Yeah, I'm just saying, we'll come out to cinema and go, I didn't watch the first one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I didn't get it.
Who's Tails? Who's Sonic, man? But no, I'll watch the first one. I'm going to watch it tonight or tomorrow night. And then me and you will go to the cinema in a couple of weeks and we'll give our opinion on it in the first week of April.
And again, I mean, like the first one, and you wouldn't know having not seen it, Joe, but Jim Carrey just steals every scene that he's in the trailer. He's just incredible in the first one. You've got Idris Elba, who plays Knuckles in it as well. So, another all-star lineup as well. I think this is going to be a big one this summer for the kids and for us as well. So if you want to check out the trailer, I'll link it up in the show notes at theretrohour.com. Now let's talk about the Raspberry Pi, because we don't mention that much on this show, do we?
Never.
Only every week, because it's so cool. And you can do everything with the Raspberry Pi. Well, someone now has done something that I think is actually a really logical thing to do with the Raspberry Pi. And I'm quite surprised no one has done this before. Actually put the smallest Raspberry Pi, the Pico, onto a cartridge.
Yeah, so the Pico's a microcontroller. And it's a lot like the kind of Arduino, but really shrunk down and in a small size, so it's quite ideal to fit on a cartridge. And this is a 16K cartridge, which is fitting on the Commodore 64. And it's quite a smart idea actually to be able to use this microcontroller, because it's got the USB port, micro USB port in there as well. And I was just thinking, looking at this, he's basically mounted it onto a C64 cartridge. He's worked through the power circuits because there was a bit of a difference in voltage in there. But, it enables you to kind of flash it and do loads of different things with it. I think this would be a good concept to maybe work on a Game Boy as well, or something that was as low powered or required as a small amount of, RAM in there.
Because, I mean, the Pico, it is very small. It's about the size of, like an old CPU. The Motorola 68K in the Amiga 500 is about the same size.
Yeah.
As a Pico, isn't it? It's a very small little device. So the fact that he can just mount it on another motherboard and, put that into a cartridge enclosure as well. It does open up a lot of possibilities as well. I mean, it's only a small demo at the moment. It's a guy called Kevin Vance from Pennsylvania, and he's got the Commodore 64 booting up and loading some software from the Pico that's mounted on this custom PCB. But I'm thinking, they could probably develop something like this into like an all-in-one kind of EverDrive.
Yeah, so at the moment, he can just produce an image viewer in there that displays the Raspberry Pi logo. But I was thinking maybe, or he was mentioning using it as a coprocessor. So, they used to have in the Mega Drive cartridges those extra chips that would, what's it called, Joe? The speed up chip that they would have for like virtual racing and stuff. Ooh.
The Super FX chip. That was
Super FX, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that was Nintendo, wasn't it?
That was Nintendo, yeah, Super Nintendo.
Yeah, so kind of using it as a coprocessor in a way and using its power, maybe with an existing game or kind of, making a cheap EverDrive alternative, like you say.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the Pico. It's a small little device and it's only got 2 megabytes of RAM on board. But I do believe, I'm looking at images of it now. I've not actually seen one of these in person before, but it looks like there are versions of it with a micro SD card slot on there.
Nice.
Maybe they all have actually, so it's obviously got to load the operating system. So maybe it could be, because I'm just thinking, because I know EverDrives with kind of, custom firmware and stuff on there and custom hardware, they're generally quite pricey. I think, most EverDrives are about 100, 120 quid, aren't they? So I'm thinking maybe something like this, if it's a Raspberry Pi Pico, you can, I know the price of everything's going up and Raspberry Pis are quite hard to get hold of at the moment. But, from what I remember, they're about, £20, I think. They're quite
and
cheap.
I think that Pico 8 was also ported onto there.
£3.60, sorry. The Raspberry Pi Pico's £3.60. So, yeah, you could get a very cheap EverDrive.
But also there's that Pico 8 engine, I think, that was put onto there. So maybe it might be a way of kind of creating a bridge to that world and that games library on one of your older consoles, which is quite interesting. I like the potential of this, It's just been developed, but kind of seeing this evolution of the game cart is quite a nice thing.
You know what's funny though, and I actually saw this today. Someone posted a picture. So I'm in a load of retro computing groups on Facebook, and a guy posted a picture of an old machine, a Commodore CDTV, and I think he had 3 separate Raspberry Pis mounted at various points on the motherboard, plugged into devices to do various things on there. It's like, and someone put the headline on top of it, "Who ate all the pies?" It's literally, they're just like, they can do anything now.
It's that kind of infamous question, like, you're using another computer to help something, and especially with the Amiga and stuff, when does it not become the original design? But I think this one kind of really sticks in there because it's just a cartridge. It's still using the kind of original processor and everything.
That is a fine line, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because when you replace too much of it, you get to the stage where literally all you use is like the keyboard.
And it's
the mouse.
like Frankenstein's monster and built up of all these different kind of machines. You've got about 4 pies in there, and it's like,
I think for me though, it's kind of a halfway point between emulation and real hardware, isn't it? If it feels like real hardware and that thing's kind of hidden away inside doing its own thing, but you're still using the original machine, that feels authentic to me, I think.
Yeah, it's a big debate in the kind of retro world at the moment, definitely.
Which will never end, I'm sure. So, if you want to keep an eye on this project, I'll put that in our show notes as well. Now, this weekend, it's fair to say we've had a busy couple of weeks, lads, I think. Because obviously, I know we've all got holiday coming up. You're off to America starting next month, Ravi, for a bit. And you've got loads planned there. You're off to VCF?
VCF East, the big Vintage Computer Festival East. And going to be meeting a lot of people there, getting some interviews and stuff. And I'm actually going to have to do some of the news shows from America. So that's going to be interesting. Random cafes. You'll hear people ordering bagels in the background. It'll be great.
And if not, we'll just put that sound effect on in the background.
Just pretend. I missed my flight.
And you're going away for a week in Wales, Joe, as well. So we've got lots that we need to obviously get done before all that. And I think, by the time the show comes out, we'll have done, in about a week, 5 interviews we've got lined up, which, bearing in mind, each interview probably takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours to do, about probably 2 or 3 hours to prep, a couple of hours to organise it all. You know, we've been working our socks off recently on this show. And coming up this weekend is something that we always look forward to. And that, of course, is doing our Patrons Hangout. Now, this is something that we do once a month. We invite all our patrons to come on. It's a bit like a big Zoom call, isn't it? Everyone just hangs out. My missus actually said to me, because she's always in, you know, the kitchen or the living room when I'm doing it, she goes, what do you guys talk about on there for like 2 or 3 hours?
Well, Dan's life. We talk about everything. I mean, we don't
talk about Dan's wife.
We talk about Dan's wife.
We do sometimes. Yeah.
And how she thinks we're all nerds. No, we tend to talk about it. It becomes a bit of a users group. You know, we talk about what we've picked up this last couple of months, you know, this last couple of weeks, like what retro buys we've got, which is always really fun, show off, you know, our collections and stuff. But we always end up talking about something like old retro mobile phones or, you know, retro films like videotapes and
mini
stuff like that.
We even get into like networking and stuff. Like it can get really geeky at some point.
Yeah,
and then it can
and
come out of it, and then it's a really nice kind of conversation.
I think it's really funny whenever somebody kind of like shows up with like a random motherboard they found in a skip.
Yeah,
and they're like, "Who can tell us what this is?" And everybody sits there trying to figure it out what it is for them and stuff like that. So it is really, really fun. And it was a lifesaver during lockdown to kind of like get on with your mates and stuff, because that's what it feels like. It feels like chatting with your mates and stuff like that. And we've been doing it a while now. So, you know, we've all become friends digitally, which is really, really cool. So if you want to get involved, you have to jump on our Patreon.
Yeah, we're going to be doing one this coming Sunday. And what I love about it as well is you can get advice. I mean, this is how like kind of niche we go on there. I was talking about a device I bought called a Real Magic Card, which is an MPEG decoder that let you play video CDs and a few games that were made for it that was released back in 1995. I want to do a YouTube video on it, and I couldn't get it working with my sound card. And one of the guys on the chat, he goes, "It's got a built-in sound card, that." And I was like, I didn't even realise that, but someone on there knew what this card was and how it works, so that saved me a load of time. When I'm prepping for this video. So, I mean, we just have so much fun doing it. And if you've ever listened to the show and you think, I should join those guys on Patreon, now will be a good time to do it, because this weekend you're going to get invited to the Hangout on Sunday night, you know, chill with us for a couple of hours, had a bit of a geek out with us. And also you're going to get a new episode of our second podcast that we do for our gold tiers and above every single month, the Retro Hour After Hours. We're recording a new episode of that this weekend, so you're going to get both things this weekend if you join us on Patreon. And I think we're going to be doing a special about retro handheld systems, aren't we?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to be talking about kind of like our memories and what we think of the retro, you know, of handhelds and stuff like that. And then, as always, when we talk about these things, we're going to do our top 5 handheld games, because there's not enough handheld consoles for us to be like, what's your top 5? Because then we kind of cover them all in one go, don't we? But yeah, really looking forward to that one.
And they kind of span all the different periods as well. So, you know, you've got like the Game Boy, the Game Gear, you've got the Atari Lynx. Don't
spoil it.
Oh, sorry. Shut up.
Yeah, it is going to be a fun one, actually. And I think I'm going to have to get a few of those systems out this week and have a little play before we record that this weekend. So if you've ever wanted to back us on Patreon, now will be a very good time to do it. And of course, you're going to keep the show coming out every single Friday. We'd really appreciate your support. You know, like I said, we've been working our socks off. So if you'd like to join us on there, all the details to back us on Patreon, you'll find it at theretrohour.com. Now, this is something that I remember seeing, actually, and it's been floating around the internet for many years. A mock-up that was made back in 2005 of a supposed portable GameCube. Have you guys seen this image before? This is something that's been floating around the internet for a long time.
I've not seen it, and interestingly on it says Nintendo GameCube Advanced, which is a pretty interesting mashup of names.
I've seen it many, many times. You know, like you say, it's one of those mock-ups that have been floating around for years, like the handheld original Xbox and the handheld Xbox 360. But yeah, there's a bit of a myth around it, like you say, for the best part of like 15, 16 years now. But it's no longer a myth. It's come true. Our dreams have been made.
Well, this is a YouTuber. He's called a Ginger of Oz, and he does a lot of these kind of console mods. He also made a handheld PlayStation 2 a while back as well. And he was curious about this image. He remembers seeing it for a long time. And he actually shows a YouTube video that's from like 2006, 2007, which was kind of showing, you know, upcoming new consoles. It's like a fake video with like, you know, mock-ups of the Xbox 720 in there and things like that. And he said he was always quite curious about this. And now he's older and he's got the skills to make it. He thought, why don't I make this a reality? And actually he tracked down the original guy who made this mock-up. He's actually found him, a guy called Demond on Instagram. And he sent him a little message and said, look, you know, what was the deal with this? Did you make it? 'Cause he found him on like an archived web forum from 2005. And this guy admitted it was a mock-up that he made while he was in college. And he posted it on the internet to see if people would think it was legit. And that was it, really. It was a bit of a troll kind of thing. But this guy, what he's done, he's always wanted one of these. And he's made it a reality, not using a GameCube, though. This is actually a Wii motherboard in a small little case with a mounted little LCD screen on there as well. So it's a little bit, imagine the larger DS. Is that the DS XL, was it called? The larger version of the Nintendo DS. It's kind of like one of those, but it's not as wide. So imagine that kind of split in half, and it's got a 4:3 screen. And he's put the innards of the GameCube controller mounted into the top of it. The screen's on a hinge. And then there is what looks like an optical drive on the front. Now, in the original mock-up, because you know how small the Nintendo GameCube discs are, they're like mini CDs, aren't they? So in the original mock-up, there was one of those coming out the front that, indicated there was a drive inside it. But actually, the drive itself is bigger than this console is made, so you couldn't fit that in there. So that is just a dummy thing. Actually, it's loading off SD cards inside the machine.
Oh, okay.
But really what he's got is, he's got a modded Nintendo Wii that he shrunk down to be, into a little case with a couple of small batteries in there as well, a little LCD screen, and put it all in a nice 3D printed case. And the whole thing is, not much bigger than half of a phone or something. It's very small.
It's really well done. It's pretty ideal for people with 3D printers creating these kind of little portable devices, because they just fit, they're the right size for 3D printing. But also he's done what a lot of kind of modders have done previously, where they've cut up the Wii. So we covered a few devices like a portable Wii and stuff where they'd actually trimmed down the motherboard of the Wii, and then they've got like the little power modules, and all of the separate stuff has actually been designed over time, so you can get the PCBs, and there's a whole active kind of modding community around cutting up and reordering the Wii, and that's probably really helped him. So he can, mock this up, design it, 3D print the case, then get all these PCBs and put it together pretty simply, and my God, it looks like a well done job. He's really, really done this impressively. I think he's had to cut some stuff down, even the heatsink he had to cut down with a Dremel and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just watching it now, and it's like he uses a lot of the innards of the GameCube controller. But with the sticks, he couldn't get the screen to close. So did he have to do some custom analog sticks there, or did he just cut them down? Do you know?
Yeah, I'll put the whole video in. It's about 25 minutes if people want to watch it, but it looks like kind of inverted, isn't it? When you look at it. It actually looks a bit like off the DS, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Stick on that, actually. Maybe he's using
I was going to say they've got like the flat, kind of like nice, it reminded me of the PSP, but yeah, the DS is probably a better example. So just to get my head around it, so it's the disc drive on it is just a fake disc drive. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So don't push the disc all the way in, because you probably won't be able to get it out, I think, yeah.
That's fair enough, though. It is what it is. With the SD card and stuff like that. But if this was a commercial product, that would just. I mean, it blows my mind anyway.
It's pretty close to one as well. The battery in there as well was pretty good. It would last for quite a while. Good.
It lasts an hour.
Oh,
that's good for one of these projects.
Better than the Game Gear, then.
Amiga laptop. Yeah. It lasts like 10 minutes.
It's kind of got that. Yeah, if you played handhelds, back in the day, it's got that retro handheld battery life on it, definitely.
Yeah.
But I mean, we do cover a lot of these kind of fan modifications, but I think this one, to me, is especially cool because it's something that this guy always dreamed of owning, and now he's made it a reality.
Yeah, I love at the end he puts it up with his Wii Boy Color, which I think we covered on the show a while back as well, where he had the Wii into the Game Boy. So yeah, really, really cool fan project. And like you say, Ravi, it's these 3D printers which just making things like so possible these days.
That's the thing, just looking at it at the moment, it looks like he's actually, you're talking about the thumbstick and the D-pad. He's actually printed the thumbstick and the D-pad.
Oh, has he? Oh, brilliant.
To fit in that lower profile. But the fact that you can do it that well. And also I remember, the early days of 3D printing where you had all those lines on it and it was like, it would always look like hatched, or you'd kind of have that kind of a texture on it. This just looks really smooth and well done, It's amazing how far these things have come, really.
I do love seeing fan projects like this. The only thing is that make me very jealous that I've got nowhere near the skills to do anything like that.
Oh, God, yeah, I'm exactly the same. I wouldn't know where to start with something like this. We just talk about it.
Yeah, that's all we can do, but it's nice to get the word out there as well, so definitely a video that's worth a watch. Yeah, very, very cool. Now, if you were to find me in an arcade when I was like, 8, 9 years old, you probably would have found me near this.
Oh, yeah.
What a game. And we still play this now, whenever we have like multiplayer sessions at your house, we get a bit of MAME on, or we fire up the Xbox, always a bit of Turtles.
Oh, yeah.
And I love the fact that, on the arcade, you can actually get 4 people on it as well, so you can always get all your mates involved in it. Brilliant game. And something that I think I must have bought or downloaded on, pretty much every system that can run it. But now there is a celebration of the classic Konami Turtles games that's coming out. And in fact, they're actually bundling a bunch of these games together. I think it's pretty much all of them, isn't it? Into a massive collection.
I think it is all of them. So this is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Cowabunga collection coming from Konami. It just says 2022 at the moment, so probably later this year. But it is 13 radical classics, which are going to be coming to PS5, PS4, Steam, Switch, Xbox Series X and S, and Xbox One. So
everything.
And like you say, pretty much the entire collection. So we've got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, Turtles in Time, the arcade game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for the NES.
It shows only now.
I'm just going to call them Turtles. Turtles 2, the arcade game. Turtles 3, the Manhattan Project for the NES. Turtles Tournament Fighters for the NES. Turtles 4, Turtles in Time for Super Nintendo. Tournament Fighters Super Nintendo. The Hyperstone Heist for Sega Mega Drive. Tournament Fighters for Sega Mega Drive. Fall of the Foot Clan for Game Boy. Back from the Sewers for the Game Boy. And Radical Rescue for the Game Boy. So pretty much every game that came out for the 8-bit and 16-bit consoles and arcades, even to like you're getting the different versions as well. So it's like, Tournament Fighters came out on the NES, the SNES, and the Mega Drive, and you get like all 3 versions of it on there, which is just crazy because all 3 versions had their own characters and bosses and stuff like that. But yeah, really interesting that it's coming out this year, because obviously there is another Turtles game coming out this year as well, Shredder's Revenge.
We talked about
which we have spoke about, coming from .mu, who did Streets of Rage 4, which is like its own kind of 16-bit version, isn't it? Like a sequel to like the arcade game and Turtles in Time and stuff like that. So interesting that Konami are doing their own release of it, which they've done quite a lot of over the years, like the Castlevania one and the Contra one. So it makes sense because they were such big games and such a big IP, and there's so many of them. But interesting that they're both coming out this year. But, maybe it will do well, like kind of off the hype of both of them. But I'll definitely be buying it because of, like you say, love those games. And
I wasn't kind of aware of those games, so something like this is really good. Dan was in the arcades, I was in the sewers looking for the turtles. So,
skateboarding, going around those tunnels,
eating pizza.
I must admit, there is more of them than I thought there was.
Yeah,
I've really only played the arcade and Turtles in Time. I played that quite a lot, but the rest of them, I don't think I played many of the others on that list.
I've played quite a few of them, and I'm aware of pretty much all of them. I don't think I could have told you the names of all the Game Boy ones. But it makes it very accessible because of a lot of the Turtle games. If you want to buy the original, like Hyperstone Heist and Tournament Fighters and Turtles in Time, these are really expensive games now for like the Super Nintendo and the Mega
it's
Drive.
Like spanning 4 systems as well.
Yeah. Pretty much, you got arcade. I think you got arcade, Game Boy, Nintendo, SNES, and Mega Drive. So five consoles there. So 13 games there. So I'm not too sure how much it's going to be or anything like that, but
it's a $39.99.
Okay,
that's a steal.
On physical and digital, it says. It doesn't. Maybe that's a physical version, $39.99.
Yeah, maybe. So, but yeah, I definitely want to get my hands on that. So, hell of a lot of games there for $40.
Yeah. And I love the fact they bundle it into, they're calling it the Cowabunga collection, which, obviously makes sense. I love the fact that they've done that and they haven't just, because they could have so easily just put them out individually for like $9.99 each, couldn't they? On Xbox Live or Switch or whatever, but it's nice having them all together. And they've actually done, there's a trailer as well they've put up that actually shows you, the gameplay, which obviously modern systems can emulate it flawlessly.
Yeah.
But they've actually gone to some nice touches, like putting, on the arcade games, the kind of arcade artwork around the edges of the screen, so 4x3, rather than stretching them, they've actually padded it out with that.
Yeah.
And there's stuff like, which I massively appreciate, now that my gameplay skills on these classic titles are not quite what they once were. I appreciate having stuff like a rewind function, which they've included.
Rewind
well,
functions and
so.
infinite continues are must-haves
Games
for us old boys now who aren't very good at games anymore.
So, yeah, very cool to see Turtles back. And like you said, with the other game coming out as well, it does feel like, it's going to be the year. It feels like 1989 again.
I know, Turtle Fever.
Again.
Year of the Turtle.
It is, isn't it? It's back. So, definitely worth a look in. Now, before we get into our chat this week, special guest Robert Leyland coming up on the show in just a moment. Let's take a quick pause to give a big thank you to this week's sponsor, and it is our very good friends at ExpressVPN. Now, it feels like a day doesn't go by when we don't read, some story about how companies are invading our privacy. And, a lot of these big companies actually make most of their money by taking and selling our personal data. They get our web history, you see all those cookie pop-ups, they look at what videos you're searching for, then they sell that data to the highest bidder. So, what's the old saying that, if you're not paying for a product, you are the product.
Yeah.
That's generally how it works, isn't it, with these big companies? Which is why there is a really good way to protect your identity from these big companies by using ExpressVPN every time you go online.
Yeah, as you know, when you're shopping on Google or something, whatever you've shopped for, something will pop up straight away, kind of usually the thing that you've actually shopped for already. But, they are tracking you, and this is a really good way of protecting yourself and making yourself anonymous online. It essentially camouflages your IP address. And, I'm going on holiday. I'm going to be using all sorts of Wi-Fi networks and stuff. Yeah. And a VPN is really good, and ExpressVPN is the best, basically, that I've used. A really fast, really good service. And even actually, amazingly, booking hotels and stuff. If I use a VPN in another country, you can get a bit of a better rate, which I just
you booked a hotel in New York. What happened there? It was going to be £200 if you booked it in Britain.
Yeah, and then
you changed ExpressVPN to be in America.
I changed it to America, and then suddenly all the prices change, and I'm like, oh my god! Wow. So, and that works with a lot of things as well. So I just think Express is great, and it's great to kind of hide your public address and not get that much data out there.
And that's the thing, we read so much about, hackers and things. It's on everyone's mind, with what's going on in the world right now. So if you don't want to be spied on, and the thing about ExpressVPN is it's dead easy to use as well, isn't it? I know you've got it on your phone, your computer. It's literally one button.
One button, or you can set it to actually launch on your computer when you're launching up. So even if I'm in like a cafe and I want to, go on the Wi-Fi straight away, Express can auto launch, and then I can connect, which is really awesome.
So if you like us and you think that your internet data belongs to you, not these big companies, then ExpressVPN is the answer. And we want you to protect your data with the #1 rated VPN provider today, and use our exclusive link, and we'll get you 3 months extra free on a 1-year package. So 3 months completely free. Head to this website, expressvpn.com/retro. That's our exclusive link. If you use that, they'll know that we sent you. expressvpn.com/retro. And of course, by supporting our sponsors, you're supporting the show as well. And a big thank you to our friends at ExpressVPN. Right, next we're going to get some inside stories on so many classic games, and of course the early days of Epix, the Koala Pad, Sega Saturn development, Sega CD, and lots more as well. Star Control games, Star Wars, with our special guest Robert Leyland is next on the Retro Hour podcast.
You're listening to the Retro Hour, and we're here with Robert Leyland. How are you doing?
Oh, great, thank you. It's good to be here.
Excellent. Yeah. And great to have you here. We always start with a question, and that's, what was your first kind of gaming experience that you remember?
Gaming as in, like, any gaming?
Any form of gaming,
gaming
really
or computer.
Memory.
It could, sometimes it's people's earliest memory.
Well, I think, when I was a little kid, we would play Snakes and Ladders and chess and drafts and stuff. But I think the more defining gaming experience was joining a gaming club at university. And University of Auckland in New Zealand, we had 2 gaming clubs. One was called the Tiddlywinks and Knucklebone Society, and that was formed by a guy who figured out that the student union would 50% fund fundraising, and he figured out that meant half price beer. So he'd get a license. We'd have a little beer thing, and they'd knock back a dozen beer or so in an evening and play some silly game. And it was really meant to be a drinking excuse. But a whole bunch of people joined that actually wanted to play games, not drink, and that meant either they had to buy some games or they got even cheaper beer. So they did both. and we played all kinds of really early, more advanced games. Like I think the big one for a while was the original Dune game. And that was also the first experience with Dungeons and Dragons, because that was in the 1970s. Yeah.
And was it long after that you started seeing video games like arcades popping up and stuff like that?
Right. Yeah. We like, obviously you're seeing Pong pop up in a local pizza joint or something was starting to happen. And also the microcomputers were really starting to become a thing. When I was in high school, I had the great fortune to be at a high school that had an advanced math class where one of the teachers knew how to program and taught us computer programming. So my first programming experience was in high school, programming Fortran on punch cards. And
wow.
we had a hand punch for cards, which was this machine that had a mechanical keyboard and little knives that poked down and poked holes in the cards, and it punched out IBM Hollerith cards that we would take down to the local bank, and they would run it through their IBM, probably a 360, the Fortran system. I think the bank did it because they got a tax write-off. We got to the joy of carrying trays of punched card, cardboard boxes of punch cards down to the local bank and running computer simulations. And that got me started. And that was probably one of the few classes I got like A's and 100% in the class, and it was like, okay, this is pretty clearly where I need to be.
When it kind of moved on from the kit computers and it went into the microsystems, what were the kind of popular ones where you were?
Commodore PET and Apple II. Those were probably the biggest. There were some Radio Shack machines, but they were not nearly as popular in New Zealand. The Apple II was pretty well supported, and funnily enough, the Commodore was as well, and that was really good. I actually quite liked programming the Commodore PET. That was actually a pretty good little machine, and that actually leads me into my gaming, into making computer games, because one of my friends had a Commodore PET, and he was really mad that he couldn't do little animations and stuff that he saw people doing on the Apple. And he asked me about it, and I wrote him some assembly language routines that he could call from BASIC that would copy bits of the screen on and off, essentially like a really primitive blitter, like it just copied rectangles around and could be used for animation. And to show him how it worked, I wrote a little sword fighting game where I had two little animated characters that would poke each other with swords. And he never really got onto it, but I thought it was kind of fun to do that. And that actually turned into a video game called Dragon's Eye, which was published by Automated Simulations, later Epix, and basically got me to move from New Zealand to the United States.
So you just rolled our next like 4 questions into one, which is amazing.
Okay.
So in terms of programming, how did you learn to do that? Did you like buy the magazines, or did you just literally pick it up and just do it yourself and just kind of trial and error?
All of the above, yes.
Yeah.
Magazines, particularly the early magazines, were really fun. The Creative Computing, there were a couple of Atari-specific ones, but a lot of it was from manufacturers' data sheets. So I had, you'd get like this giant fat book of 6800 programming, and then 68000 and 6502 and all the chips. There were the data sheets. And a lot of stuff from the magazines, a lot of stuff basically because by then I was in college or going through college, and we had access to more information, college libraries and stuff that let us get more information.
So then jumping ahead a little bit, so you mentioned that it was Dragon's Eye that got picked up by Epix, was it?
Yes. Yeah.
So what was how did that happen? How did it get picked up? What's the story there with you then? Getting the job for them and stuff?
And they were originally called automated simulations, weren't they?
Right. At the time, they were automated simulations, and there were maybe 4 companies in the US that were making computer games that were actually publishing, as opposed to like the Wizardry guy who was making his own game and publishing it himself. There were only 3 or 4 companies, and when I got the game to a point where I felt fairly good about it, it was actually originally called The Magician's Hat. Because that was one of the little graphic icons that it was a treasure you could find in the game. I sent it to 4 companies, and Automated were the ones that responded the most positively. A couple of them didn't respond at all. My memory's a bit fading here, but Automated responded positively and said they'd like to pick it up. I talked with them on the phone, and they sent a contract, but they said, we'll need an Apple II version. So my company in New Zealand at that time was making business software on Apple IIs. So I basically snaffed an Apple II and wrote and converted it from the PET to the Apple in, I don't know, a week or two. And then we sent that to them, and they were good. And they said, well, we really want it for the Atari. And I said, well, okay. And I came over to the US, visited them. They came back with an Atari, and we set it up in New Zealand, and I programmed the Atari version. And I really loved the Atari. That was such a nice little computer to work on. Of all the little home computers, it had far and away the best programming environment. And the chipset was designed by Jay Miner, who later went on to build the Amiga and the Atari Lynx. And it was a really solid little machine. It had the people who had developed the core operating system built into it. It had a real BIOS with a communication protocol. And anyway, I'm getting a bit technical, but basically it was a nice machine. Good. It was a nice machine inside to program.
Was it the 400 or the 800 you were using?
Well, they were the same machine, 400, 800, 1200. They just had different amounts of memory. I mostly, like programming, I was using the 800. That was the pretty much the target machine.
I was wondering, like, because in Britain at the time, it was very much like a cottage industry. And like you said, they had Scott Adams kind of releasing his games, in baggies in a shop, kind of getting it out that way. So how was... how was automated simulation set up, and what was it like?
Well, they were a bit more professional than that, but I will say that on the baggies thing, that's actually how we made games in New Zealand. We borrowed a cassette duplicator, copied a couple of hundred cassettes, and packaged them up in little bags that were little, almost Ziploc bags that were stapled together with the Xeroxed instructions and stuff. So Automated was a bit more polished than that. They put them in cardboard boxes. They had a disk duplication service, so they made floppy disks with actual labels, and they actually hired professional artists and writers to write the manuals and do cover art and stuff. And to this day, I still really like the Dragon's Eye cover art that was done by George Barr. I think he might have passed on now. He was getting a bit old last time I heard. And they made posters, and I still have a few of the posters from Dragon's Eye. And they really went for the art. This is automated simulations, and they had a background. They had a Dungeons and Dragons group that played within the company and all this kind of stuff. And it was right about this time that they were starting to transition to the name Epix. And actually, Diane Asher, who was their director of marketing, was sort of the push for that. And a year and a half later, we got married. So, and I've been married to Diane since then. So, yeah.
Lovely stuff.
Yeah.
And so Dragon's Eye released like many games back then on the multi-system. How was it like porting that?
At the time, porting was a new concept. There weren't typically when they were doing the games, Automated actually had a bit of a system because they had not really, I wouldn't call it a library, but they had a group of people who did the games for each of the systems. And I was one of the few people that actually did the same game on multiple systems. Typically what they had done was one of their guys had built a system using, I think it was the Apple II, that drew the walls and did their games. And then somebody else, instead of porting it, they kind of re-implemented it on each of the other platforms. They used the same core code, but the underlying some of the underlying it, but some of the stuff was essentially re-implemented. So it was a bit more haphazard, and a lot of the companies only made games for one platform, or if they published games for multiple platforms, their titles were only on one platform because a coder or a programmer and because at that time the concept of a game designer, distinct from the programmer, was fairly limited. And one of the things that was really nice about Automated in those early days was they had actual designers, John Freeman, Paul Ritchie, and even the president of the company were actually designers more than they were programmers. So I made lifelong friends there with Paul Ritchie and Eric Wilmunder, and who went on to LucasArts, and Paul, who went on to do Star Control and was my boss for 15 years on Skylanders later on.
It's really important having people like that because, some of the titles would have been easier to do, like text adventures and stuff, and, have them on different systems. But when you're getting into an area with graphics and stuff like that, it needs to have that game design eye.
Yeah. And it was also really important to meet people who could design a game rather than program it, because in your youth you think you can do everything, but in fact that early specialization was really important. And we made Paul and John and I and John's wife Anne made a couple of games for Electronic Arts, and those were Murder on the Zindernerf and Archon. And we had two designers, John and Paul, working together, and two programmers, myself and Anne, and we would help each other because we were both working on Atari systems, so we were trading code backwards and forwards. But the design aspect was awesome because John and Paul were both pretty methodical and could produce stuff that made it feasible for us to program, to code into the games. That was a fun relationship. That was a good work environment, that one.
It sounded like it was turning into a proper kind of company, and people taking it seriously and having designers there. How did it change into Epics and kind of expand and grow?
So let me back up. So I came to the US. I met Diane. I took an Atari back to New Zealand. I finished programming Dragon's Eye, and then I came back to Automated Simulations to go to work there. They actually, they offered me a job and hired me. But in the process of that, in that year, a lot changed at Epics, and they had decided that they were going to shift from floppy disks and computer games, the computer side, PC in particular, to more consoles. So they were starting to make cartridge games. And so I was there for about somewhere between 4 and 6 months. I forget the actual time frame, but we made multiple cartridge games for the Atari, and we made versions of them for the Apple II and the Tandy as well. And it was a weird transition. Some of the people who were there that I enjoyed working with had left, and there were other people there that they were nice. I'm not saying they're bad, but it was a different environment. So I didn't actually stay there very long, and moved on to doing the work with John and Paul on for Electronic Arts. Because it seemed to me that doing cartridge games at that time was the wrong direction. And I think they did okay with some of them. I mean, they did produce the Olympics games or something, their sports games, which is interesting because those were, I think, some of the first games that were really heavily sports oriented. EA eventually did really, really well with basketball, and then later football and stuff much later. C64 was a big deal. I was doing quite a bit of programming on the C64, and they were actually trying to figure out a way to do a cartridge for the C64. I don't think that ever happened. The C64 had a hardware port on the side, but I don't think they actually succeeded in making cartridges for it.
I think there was a gaming system that was a short-lived kind of one. I think.
Oh yeah. Later on, that's right. Later on, Commodore had systems that had cartridge slots.
So the next game that you did, was it Star Control?
Yes, I think so. So there was a little interlude there. I'll just let you know. Having worked on video games for a while, Diana and her business partner Steve had formed a company called Island Graphics, and they were doing computer software. And so, and they needed someone who could program an Atari, so they kind of hired me away from Epix, keeping it in the family. And Steve and I programmed a product called the Micro Illustrator, which we OEM'd to device manufacturers, people making computer tablets and typically graphics tablets. The big one was the Koala Pad.
Oh yeah, we know that one. Yeah, that was hugely popular, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, Steve did the Apple II version, I did the Atari version, and we had a contractor do the Commodore 64 version later on. And so we did the Koala Pad, the Atari Touch tablets, I forget. In the end, there was something like 27 different versions of that product on different machines as far apart as the Japanese MSX system. Pretty much anything that could have a color display on a microcomputer on it, we made a version for. So, and that got me into computer graphics for a while. So I started doing more computer graphics stuff, and that lasted until the early 1990s. And that's when I decided, okay, I'm done with computer graphics. It's time to go back to games because I was having more fun. And that's when I worked with Paul and Fred on Star Control, which led to ToeJam Earl. Yeah.
So how did you get back into it then? Because we were looking at the games you worked on, and like you say, we saw there was a gap there. So right. I'm glad you filled in the gap there. So how did Star Control come about? And it was a big hit. So what do you think kind of made it special as well?
Oh, okay. Well, some interesting things about Star Control. The first one is the lead engineer on Star Control, the lead programmer, was Fred Ford, and Fred had been one of the people that I'd hired at Island Graphics. So for a while I technically wasn't Fred's direct boss, he was a programmer when I was a manager managing a division. It was a different division, but I'd interviewed him when he came to Island Graphics. Fred was introduced to Paul because Paul did. We used to do art contests, and we would get people like Errol Otis and Paul and Matt Genza to come in and do art for us as part of a contest. You might win $100 and we'd get these pictures that we'd use in displays and things. Anyway, Paul did a really an interesting little picture that was so quick. It was a snapshot of him with mirrored glasses, and he worked the mirrored glass angle to put himself in his own mirrored glasses. And it was a really clever, effective technique. Anyway, so Paul and Fred met through Matt and through me. And Fred had done video games on like little Japanese console systems, and they started the Toys for Bob, and were putting together Star Control. And when it was time for me to leave Island Graphics, it kind of made sense to come and do some work with them. And so I worked on Star Control 1, and in particular on the Sega Genesis version of Star Control 1, which was really fun because that was done through Accolade, and Accolade was not a licensed Genesis developer.
Was it they did the big cartridge version of it? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Everybody else was doing 8 meg cartridges, and Activision, not Activision, Crystal Accolade, thank you, did a 12 megabyte cartridge, which was like, oh, awesome. But because we didn't really have access to the real specs of the Genesis, all we had what was essentially reverse engineered documentation. And
so many of our guests have to say that about the Genesis and the Mega Drive.
It's a Mega Drive, and so there was a lot of stuff that we didn't actually know about. We didn't really understand the DMA system, so it was actually kind of slow to put graphics up on the screen without the DMA system. And So there are points where when you're playing Star Control that it can get a bit chunky and slow, particularly when the two ships get close to the planet and start shooting a lot of stuff at each other, which unfortunately is a big part of the game. It can slow down a little bit, but we implemented voice speech synthesis on the Genesis using the little internal Z80 sound processor. We had scaling graphics on the for the ship-to-ship combat, which is basically the controls are like asteroids. If you guys have played Star Control, Star Control 1, yeah, and it was a really fun development project. Fred's really a genius programmer, so I would say I did learn a lot from him. He probably got annoyed at my questions, but it was okay. And having learned the Genesis, that became sort of our system of choice for a while. So I did, I think, 2 or 3 more titles on the Genesis after that. One of which, of course, was ToeJam Earl.
Well, Star Control 2 as well was kind of ported to the 3DO, and it had like extra multimedia features. What did you think of the 3DO when it came out? And like, did you think it's a bit of a underrated system?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was a great system. The original Star Control 2, the work was done on the PC, which I was involved a little bit on. Mostly on Star Control 2, I was already working on other projects. Oh, you know what? One thing I wanted to say about Star Control, or one of the reasons I think it was so interesting and successful, was it was the first almost crowd-funded game. Or crowdsourced game. When Island did those little contests for art, I think that sparked something in Paul, and we got all the music. He got all the music for Star Control done by making they implemented a mod format player and announced a contest that you could win money and from by submitting tunes to Star Control, and we got hundreds of tunes. Hundreds of some of them were just unbelievably good. Some you probably were better off not hearing, but a lot of them were really good, and particularly some guys in Finland who were just absolutely expert at putting together these music tracks using this mod format. And so particularly that was used for Star Control 1 for the themes for the different species that fought each other, and it was a real challenge getting that to work on the Genesis, particularly with the voice playback at the same time. So because we had to do multiple channels, and that it was a good challenge. But the reason I think it was so successful too was that they came through with the system, and when Paul and Fred were doing Star Control 2, they did something similar. They just got a bunch of their friends to help them write dialogue trees for the different alien species. And, Paul had a big plan about how to do it. And we would have meetings, and groups of us would get together and do dialogue trees for all the different opponents and different races that you ran into in Star Control 2. Super fun. Really, really a fun collaborative effort.
So you mentioned earlier on a really iconic game there, which we've got a couple of questions about. ToeJam Earl ended up being such a cult game. What was your involvement there? How tell us about that?
Okay, well, so ToeJam Earl is primarily Greg Johnson and Mark Vorsanger, and they were in the office next door to us when I was working with Paul and Fred, and they needed some coding help because the coding tasks on the game were pretty large, and having just implemented Star Control 1 and having a pretty good familiarity with the sound system, I did the sound system for ToeJam Earl and contributed some gameplay stuff and a bit of graphic stuff, and I did a lot of optimizing and work on it. But honestly, the majority of that work, I'm not going to toot my own horn here, was Mark, and the design was Greg. I'm responsible for Earl's pants falling down in the elevator, and and one or two other minor things, but really that's Mark and Greg. And I was really, it was a good project. It was a fun project. It was also nice at that point to be an actual Sega project, because now I could actually look at the Sega manuals and understand how the Genesis was supposed to be used.
And did that make it a lot easier? Because, like you say, it was a really fun, innovative game, and there was a lot of audio on that game. Was it hard to fit it all in, or having the manuals now finally, did that make it a hell of a lot easier for you?
Well, some parts of it made it easier. Yeah, fitting it in was there was a lot of compression involved. I remember that, doing compression systems, but the audio in the Genesis was primarily an FM synthesizer. So you played a note and you set up waveforms and instruments, and these days it would be regarded as a pretty primitive system. But we also needed to include again, digitized audio. And that digitized audio can take up a lot of space, particularly on those early systems, because this was like pre PK zip. Like you couldn't do zip style compression on those things. It was much simpler systems.
Well, you also worked on Racing Aces, which is quite interesting because the Mega CD came out at that time, and you must have had a bit of boost of technology. And also, was there kind of like a bit of a rivalry between the 32X developers and the Mega CD?
Yeah, Mega CD. So yeah, that was interesting because at that time I partnered up with Greg Hammond. Remember I mentioned Eric Hammond, who'd done One-on-One. So Greg, I partnered with Greg. He was a producer at LucasArts at that time, and he had an idea to make a game, make some games, and we went and talked to Sega. And having done the Genesis stuff, we were interested in continuing to do work with Sega, and we presented a game design for an airplane racing game, and we implemented it. I implemented it on the Genesis first, but the frame rate was pretty low. We're talking, 4 or 5 frames a second. Like it was pretty damn slow because, quite honestly, the Genesis, for all its blast processing, really wasn't designed for doing 3D. And they suggested the 32X, which I looked at, but they said, no, this title's got a longer time frame before it's finished, so let's go straight to the Mega CD. And basically that had a sped up 68,000 CPU, and at this point we were doing almost all of our programming in C, which is really beneficial because it meant that converting code from the Genesis, the base Genesis, to Mega CD wasn't that bad. The game code was straightforward, and we did the graphics stuff inside the Genesis, dual processing. But mostly what it boiled down to was you dumped some data into the Genesis, and the Genesis threw it up on the screen, and the Genesis wasn't actually doing very much. So yes, technically it was dual processing, but one of them was really just an output device, not actually like doing any brain work. And it was fun. I mean, we had some issues with that, and I learned a very valuable lesson, which is don't rely on the QA testers' feedback for game difficulty, because the QA testers get really, really good at playing the games, and they kept telling us it was too easy. So we kept making it more and more difficult. And then the game was just impossibly hard for normal people to play. It was just one of those things where we'd ramped up the difficulty because of what the testers had said to us, and yet it turned out to be overkill. But it was a fun title, and it led directly to working on the Saturn, which was a different experience.
Yeah, that's actually our next question. So that segued really nicely. So, like you say, you programmed quite a few games for the Sega Saturn. What was that experience like? Was it as difficult as people say it was? And did you think this is the future, or did you think maybe the future was with the PlayStation?
So we got as we were finishing up Racing Aces, they wanted us to work on the Saturn, and they shipped up to us a prototype Saturn, which was a 19-inch rack with 4 printed circuits on it, 4 giant PC printed circuit boards. Wow. 19 inches is half a meter. So you're looking at 4 half-meter square boards with giant fans that made this awful racket, and into the office, and we connected it up and got some graphics going. And one thing was really clear early on was that the system was wonderfully fast. It was horribly documented. Like the documentation for it was really horrible. And its 3D capabilities were very, very limited. Literally in the room next to us, we had the Toys for Bob guys with a PlayStation 1, and it was doing graphics that the Saturn couldn't hope to match. We tried to, there were some things the Saturn was really fabulous at. Let me give you its really positive qualities first. The first really positive quality was it had probably the most powerful CPU of any system up to that point. It had 2 Hitachi 1632-bit RISC processors that were blazingly fast, and it could make up for a lot. It had a graphics overlay system that was capable of doing almost anything you saw in the arcades. In the arcades, you could create any of the arcade games you could create on the Saturn. And as I recall, it had a pretty decent sound system too. Yeah. What it didn't have was it didn't have something that could actually draw polygons. It had a very crude system for drawing polygons into a graphics buffer, but it was a hopelessly archaic concept for the way they were doing it. It wasn't just us, but a number of groups talked to Sega about it from inside the US and just said, hey guys, this isn't going to work. And I think by the time it got into the hands of the software developers, it was too late. They'd already committed to the system. So we did what we could with it, and Greg and I made Gen War, which was a sci-fi shooter game that, again, was a lot of fun to make, and we were able to create some, good 3D graphics. But by comparison, I think the same product, I'm looking back in hindsight, would have been a lot better on a machine like the PlayStation. It was just, the PlayStation used a more modern architecture for drawing polygons than the Saturn did. Yeah.
I was going to just say, you completely hit the nail on the head my understanding of the Saturn is it was perfect for arcade ports of 2D games, all these 2D fighters like the X-Men games and stuff like that. It ran beautifully, smoothly, amazing games, but like you say, it just couldn't compete with the PlayStation when it came to those, 3D polygons and stuff.
Yep, there was no concept of blending. You could, it could draw polygons, and it could draw them fairly quickly using a really weird line drawing algorithm. But it had no, in technical terms, it had no read, modify, write, and no blending capability. So you couldn't anti-alias, you couldn't do smoke, for example. Just the simple thing like drawing smoke.
You know what? I'm not a technical guy, but I was about to say, is that one of the things I always see is they compare water graphics and smoke graphics and fog graphics, on games that came out on both the PlayStation and on the Saturn. And they always say, in the PlayStation, it looks like it is actually fog, whereas on the Saturn, it just looks like lots of dots over the screen to make it look like smoke.
That's pretty fair. Yeah, that is pretty fair, because it didn't have any blending, any capability of blending 2 pixels together. You could draw over the top of something, but you couldn't put a transparent thing down. Is what it is. Yeah, very sad.
Toys for Bob as well. They were working on some interesting titles, ones that came out for the Saturn as well. Did you end up seeing any? Because I remember Pandemonium.
Yeah, I did the Saturn.
Quite a big hit.
I did the Saturn port of Pandemonium. So, So I didn't do very much on the original version of Pandemonium. We play tested it and enjoyed the hell out of it. But they needed to do a Saturn version, and I did the Saturn port.
I was going to say I do have it myself. So was it difficult to get it working on, or?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't difficult to get it to work. And in fact, as I said, the processing speed of the Saturn eclipsed the PlayStation by probably an order of magnitude, but getting it to look good was extremely difficult. Things like the wind and the tornado effects and some of the clouds and puffy explosions and stuff were just way harder to do on the Saturn.
It was a great concept for a game because it was kind of 2.5D as well. Well, it had that kind of 3D-ness, and then it was still a side scroller. Really, really exciting, fun game. I remember that really stood out in those early days.
Yeah, it was a fun title to work on. We also did The Horde, which was essentially a 3X game, where you're doing...
Yeah, it's like an isometric view, isn't it?
Yeah, isometric view game, yeah. Which I think they did for the PlayStation, and they also did it for the 3DO, as I recall.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
So you worked on, was it Congo next that you worked on? Congo, the movie, the game?
We did. Oh, God. Yeah.
There we go. Oh God.
Yeah.
So in terms of Congo, the film was expected to be huge. It was the next Michael Crichton film following Jurassic Park's success. Unfortunately, it wasn't. What was the vibe like working on that game? Was there a lot of pressure from the studios?
Oh yeah. In fact, there were two or three aspects of working on it of working on Congo that made it extremely challenging. One was the source material itself. Before the movie was released, we had very limited access to the source material. We did have, obviously reading the book, but the book and the movie are quite a bit different. The book is closer to the sort of, if you like, the original, which was an old story called of H. Rider Haggard, which was written around the turn of the century. I forget the title now. Something about gold. But the movie kind of followed that story, but really kind of didn't. And so we had some source material, but the hard part about Congo was technically it was challenging because we were trying to do a jungle on a system that couldn't draw enough polygons to really simulate the foliage properly. And of course, as the movie got closer and then when it got released, it was such a dud that your morale goes away. Your morale sinks. And you also have this problem where everything you did had to go through a vetting process. And some of the vetting process was at Sega. And then there was a second vetting process at, I think, Paramount. And that process was very negative. You had to go through so much circular submit, resubmit, submit, reject, resubmit, submit, reject. That modify cycle. And it was several days long. It wasn't like you got the answer back the next, like that afternoon. It would be 3 or 4 days. And then you'd have to revise that art or that design thing. And those delays just stretched out the project and made it terribly late. And the movie was such that the motivation wasn't high. It was a difficult project, but you learn a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of learning a lot, it once again segues very nicely. You then, I'm not sure if it was the next game you worked on, but it says it was on Moby Games. Very high profile game, The Phantom Menace for the PlayStation 1.
Okay, yes. We were so excited to work on a Star Wars project.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it's coming back. Star Wars is back after 20 years,
20 years. Oh, yeah. And it was really exciting. We got, I was working at that time for Big 8 Productions. We'd rolled off that after Jumping Jack, which was the company that we'd done Congo and then Gedwar and then Congo together with, had folded. And Big Ape so Big Ape was started by a couple of ex-LucasArts people, and we're in Marin County in Northern California, and Lucasfilm is in Marin County, Northern California, and they're about maybe 8 miles from our office, from the space we were working from. And so it was pretty easy to go there and work with them. So we would go down there and visit them and see some of the source material as it was going, as Ian McCaig and the other artists there were generating this really fantastic visionary material. It was really neat. And we had a writer inside LucasArts who was somewhat was helping us somewhat. And we were developing an engine that could produce levels and all that kind of stuff. And it was pretty neat. And we had a synopsis of the story. We had an outline, and it seemed pretty good.
Yeah.
And then one day we got the script.
Oh wow.
And then another day we went there and watched what's called the maquette version, which is basically the actors reading the script in front of cardboard cartoon backgrounds. So the actors are green screened, and the background is essentially like panels from a comic book.
Okay.
And the script was one thing. Seeing the actors doing the lines, it was like, oh, this is not wonderful. We went to this the theater at the Lucasfilm Ranch at George's Ranch, and watched it in the theater there. And nobody said anything when we got out until we got back to the office, and I was like, that wasn't very good, was it? Like nobody wanted to be the one to say it, but but everybody was like, "Oh, this." There was a lot of stuff in there. I really hope that they can edit that the editing removes all that stuff before the things. And kind of, we were talking amongst ourselves and realized that, well, it does have to go through this editing process, and it'll probably, a lot of that stuff that we really didn't like will probably get clipped out. Nope, it was all there. It was all in the movie. It was all there. Yep.
I was wondering, LucasArts games had a big history of kind of gaming and stuff. Why were they then coming to a kind of external company?
Oh, that's politics, really, inside LucasArts. They alternate from doing a lot of external developers to doing a lot of internal developers. And it varies a lot based on who's in charge at the time. Like, as they change company presidents, they'll set off in a new direction, and they'll wax and wane on internal versus external development. It was a really interesting company. I spent quite a bit of time there, particularly working on the PlayStation version of Phantom Menace, which I pair programmed with Nick. He was a really nice guy, really competent, and we worked together pretty well. And his partner, we were all three of us in one office, was doing the underlying engine, which was honestly a really challenging project. And he was pretty stressed. And it was one of those things, because I'd done the same thing when we were working on the original Phantom Menace and also Simpsons Wrestling. Getting the underlying engine to work, it's either all going to work or none of it's going to work, because it's all so closely tied together. It's got to be, all the jigsaw pieces have to fit together. And when they do, they all fit together at once. Yeah. But as you're developing it, you've got 500 pieces scattered around, and individually some pieces of them look pretty good, but they aren't together. And so there's this pressure on you to put it all together, but it has to be right. And once it is right, it's fantastic. So I had the same experience, and I had some sympathy with him, but it was pretty stressful for him at the time. Yeah. And
So, I mean, I adored the Phantom Menace, but I was 10 when it came out. And I had the game as well. But, something you touched on earlier on with, some of the other games we spoke about was I found the game really difficult. And I don't know if it was just because I was, 9, 10 years old. But do you think that was down to play testing again? Or, do you think it was just...
Possibly. It wasn't meant to be an easy game. I mean, at that time also, there was an expectation that computer games were supposed to be difficult, that they were supposed to be challenging. Yeah. If you remember, the original version of ToeJam and Earl is pretty damn challenging as well. And later on, when as we redid the game, when we did ToeJam and Earl 3, we'd learned a lot about what allows people to play games. And in fact, one of my Genesis projects was the Game Genie. Do you guys remember there was one called Game Shark and the Game Genie?
Yeah, I've got a Game Genie right next to me. The Sega one.
Genesis one, yeah. So I did that. I did that one. I did the coding on that one. That was me. And if you look in the little book, there are cheat codes for, I don't know, 20 or 30 games. And I think I did cheat codes for 3 or 4 of those games, including ToeJam and Earl and Star Control, because we'd just done both of those titles. So we were able to generate codes, and those honestly have some really good codes in them. Star Control, I think there's a code in there that lets you have 3 planets, which is like not an obvious thing to do given the code, but because we had access to the source code, we're able to say, "Hey, Fred, what can we do?"
Yeah.
and we were able to put some neat things in it. And one of the things the Game Genie taught me was that once you've put a game into people's hands, it really doesn't matter how they play it. Like if they want to cheat their way through a game, go for it. If they're enjoying themselves, if it's, I mean, you're selling, what we're doing when we make video games is we're creating something that is there to entertain people.
And that's really interesting that you say that, because my memories of, the Phantom Menace, which is like 23 years ago now, was literally that this game is really hard and you're making me fight these droid tanks with my lightsaber. I can just use the rocket launcher and blow everything up. So it's interesting that you said that it's actually about the person who plays it and how do they want to play the game. That's really interesting.
And I like how the kind of, the Game Genie was like, it was like the peeking and poking of kind of earlier days, but being able to do that on a console, which is pretty awesome. It's kind of back to roots, Yeah,
and a lot of the Game Genie games that were supported by the Game Genie typically had one code which you had to enter to essentially unlock it. Right, I don't know if you look at that, and that was because the developers had realized that that things like Game Genie and Game Shark were around, so they'd put some code in to do like a checksum of their ROM to make sure it was valid, that it hadn't been tampered with, and that first code you were putting in was the code that disabled the checking code. And I gave a talk at GDC once, and one of the developers asked me how he could block the Game Genie from working, and I said, my first thing was, well, why would you want to? This is something that we're doing for the players, for your customers, and it's free advertising for you. And he said, no, I just want them to play the game my way. And I said, okay, fine. All you have to do is put in, I forget what the number was, I think five different ways that the thing has to defeat, and it won't work. Sure enough, he did it, and his games never appeared in any of the Game Genie codes. So okay, you got what you wanted.
So after Phantom Menace, you mentioned you were actually the senior programmer of Simpsons Wrestling, and me and my friends, we love that game, and I know sometimes people like to bash it these days, but I've got a really, really soft spot for it. What was it like working on that game, and was there a lot of pressure? Because obviously it's such a iconic IP, and it was, really in the prime of The Simpsons. What was that like?
Yeah, it was super fun because, Simpsons were fun characters, and we had some interesting ideas about things to do in the game, like the groundskeeper and his rakes whacking people in the face and stuff like that. Mostly what I did on Simpsons Wrestling was the engine, the game engine. And that had for that, we had this guy, Glenn, oh my gosh, I can't remember his last name. Anyway, Glenn was in Arizona and we were in California, and he produced a tool for the designers. And it was kind of an interesting concept. And we used it on Phantom Menace, and then we used it on Simpsons Wrestling.
Okay.
And one of the things that was really interesting about the tool, I mean, there was some interesting graphic stuff that was much more germane to the systems at the time, not germane beyond that, was that it had a scripting language built into it that was not quite point and click, but pretty much the only time you had to type anything was when you were inputting either text, for dialogue lines, or numbers for how fast something moved, or how high it jumped, or which way they were looking, or something. So the actual typing aspect of it was minimal. It was all point, click, drag and drop, build stuff in. And the thing that was very interesting about it was that it was like a database query system where the game already knows all of the assets that are built into the game. So it knows about this texture, it knows about the such and such, and it refers to them by their, probably, I think in that case, at that time it was file names, but since the artist that was developing the things was like literally in the room next door, or even beside you when our guys were scripting the game stuff, they would just talk to each other and pass the resources around. And it meant that it was a really critical lesson. It meant that they could prototype level design and prototype the game very, very rapidly. So they could experiment a lot, which meant that there was some gameplay aspects of it that were pretty fun. Simpsons Wrestling was a bit more limited in terms of gameplay, simply because you were oriented on this ring, whereas Phantom Menace, there was this adventure mode, and we had to script AIs for the non-player characters and stuff, that the robots, the droids that you had to fight with your lightsaber and didn't like, but also for like Princess Amidala when she follows you around in the city. In Simpsons Wrestling, it was a bit simpler because all we were really doing was programming the scripts for the non-player character, for the characters you weren't playing, the ones you were fighting against. And when two people were fighting each other, I think that was good. That didn't need as much scripting. That was all to do with the control systems. It was fun. We had a similar problem with Simpsons Wrestling that we'd had with Congo, because it was the same group. It was Paramount, and we had to. I'm naming companies, but that's okay. I'm retired, so it doesn't matter anymore. And where anything we did, any character design, any change, all of our lines of dialogue had to go through Paramount, this group at Paramount that would then send it back. And we had that same issue where it took forever for stuff to go there and come back. And towards the end of the project, I will give them credit, they got a lot better at doing it as the pressure on them increased to do it as well, to get it done on time. But yeah.
And that was actually, once again, my next question was did you guys get much creative control on like what characters went into the game? The move lists that they had, because obviously every single character, Homer eating his donuts to restore his health and stuff like that, it was all relevant to the show. Did you guys have to come up with that, or was it like notes were sent over to you by the studio, put this in the game, or did you have to send it to them for approval and stuff like that?
The latter. We did the creative stuff, and we would send it to the show to Paramount for approval, and things like most of the things with the moves, that wasn't an issue. Much more of an issue were lines of dialogue and occasionally animations. And we got lines of dialogue from the Simpsons writers that Paramount then rejected, which was just blew me away. I mean, these were the show writers wrote these lines of dialogue. They went to Paramount's thing and then got rejected before we could put them. Anyway,
I was going to say, like, did Matt Groening and stuff write it? But as it turns out, he was, and then it gets declined. So brilliant, good old studios.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, some of that I'm sure was legal issues. When they're making video games, particularly then, they were trying to be much more culturally sensitive. Like an individual episode of The Simpsons, or these guys, Cartman and those guys, they weren't as culturally sensitive because they would be satirizing a particular topic in that show, so they could be culturally insensitive. But if you take those culturally insensitive remarks out of context and drop them into a video game where there's no connection to the episode they came from, then it starts to become problematic. So we fully got a lot of them, and some of them we would after a while we would realize, okay, this isn't going to pass them. We're not even going to bother sending it down, because we already knew that this particular statement would not fly. It was not a...
Well, you were still kind of working, and this is a bit modern for us, but you were working with Toys for Bob, and you ended up on the Skylanders series. Were you surprised at how those games were going to be taken up by the public and actually became an absolutely massive hit?
Yes and no. I mean, so after doing the Simpsons wrestling and something else, I forget what it was. There were a couple of projects in between. I went to work for Toys for Bob doing programming on the Xbox, because the work I'd done on ToeJam Earl 3 was all on the Xbox, and they'd been programming on the PC and the PlayStation. And funny enough, they needed an Xbox programmer, so here I come, and I become their Xbox programmer. And we were working on Disney's Extreme Skate Adventure, and that was some.
But there's some Tony Hawk stuff as well.
Absolutely, that was the Tony Hawk engine from Infinity Games that was used as the underlying code. So all the skateboarding moves and stuff were already in the game. And what we were doing was creating storylines that fit within the worlds of the 3 Disney franchises that were built into the game, and bringing it up on different machines and creating more story-oriented levels. One of the things about the Tony Hawk games is they typically have challenges and achievements in a level, but there's almost no story in the level, in a Tony Hawk level. It's just a collection of things you can do, and it's all about the tricks you can pull off and the grinds, the rails, the spine transfers. And wow, I almost sound like I know what I'm talking about with skateboarding. I learned a lot. But in Disney's Adventure, we needed to actually have story levels in there. So there were achievements, but we made the achievements be story driven. So the bully in one of the levels wants you to bring him a hamburger, and so that was implemented in the Tony Hawk engine as a goal, and you had to go to like 2 different places or 3 different places to get the ingredients and bring it to him before you could advance to the next, before it would unlock another goal. So we used their system to create a goal-driven story, and it was interesting. It was that was a pretty fun which and we did another skateboarding title a little bit later on using the same engine, which came out for the Wii.
Downhill Jam.
Downhill Jam, yeah. And Downhill Jam was pretty fun because it was one of the first Wii titles. It's certainly one of the Wii titles that there was a chance that we would be included kind of in the box, but we were just outside that window and ended up being an independent title for it. But the Wii was fascinating. It was like one of those machines that comes along, and technically it's not wonderful, but it's fantastic as far as this whole concept of physical interaction with the video game. So in our case, we were using the tilt sensors on the control to control your skateboard, and it was awesome. I mean, just the ability to do that kind of stuff was really, really neat. And we made these long streaming levels. I did the code that streamed segments together, stitched segments together in the game, so that you would have these really, really long linear
elements. So it feel flawless.
Yeah,
it would.
Yeah, it flowed.
And that was the kind of start of the Skylanders as well on the Wii, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. That was right at the beginning, right at the start of Skylanders. We'd completed that. I mean, there's a couple of games that were in between there, which are really relevant. We did Disney's Adventure, Disney's Extreme Skate. Then we did a game called Madagascar. Yeah. And then we did Downhill Jam. Then we did Madagascar 2, I think, or I forget, but there was a couple of games. But the key thing was that there was a lot of core competence built up inside Toys for Bob for doing games that worked for kids, worked for particularly young kids.
Yeah,
and that actually 101 Dalmatians, which they did while I was doing something else. Toys for Bob had done 101 Dalmatians. And Madagascar and Madagascar 2 were done using an engine using Fred's engine, which was a superset and not directly derived from, but based on the same concepts that we'd used back on Simpsons Wrestling and The Phantom Menace, of a scripting language system for enabling designers. One of the things about Toys for Bob is that, at least in those days, it was a very designer game designer friendly company. I mean, when the CEO, the head of the studio head is a game designer, it makes sense that the company is very design friendly. And mostly as programmers, what we did was provide tools and support for the game designers designing the game. I mean, there was a lot more to it than that, but that was our priority. And I think it was the right way to do it. It meant that we could produce huge, AA, AAA grade titles with a very small staff of programmers. I think at the time we did Madagascar, I think there were only 5 programmers at Toys for Bob. We had 30 designers, and that was enough programmers to do the entire thing because we'd created an engine that the designers could use. And it wasn't just the designers, it was also the artists could incorporate their art and sound and music all conveniently and gave the designers full access to all of it. Very clever system. And these days you can kind of do some of that in products like Unity and Unreal Engine, but this is 15 years ago that we were 15 almost 20 years ago that we were doing this, and it really worked well. And the first versions of Skylanders were done using that system, and it was such a contrast to go from that system to the Tony Hawk engine, which is very programmer engineering heavy, and it has a scripting system, but the scripting system is unfriendly, shall we say. It was one of the things where when a bug or an error occurred, the designers pretty much had to get a programmer to come help them find it because it was too weird to try and figure stuff out. And so the contrast between those two couldn't have been more extreme. Anyway.
I think it's really like kind of full circle from originally where you're talking about automated simulations and you're talking about a few designers there, when there's majority programmers everywhere. And now you're finally in Toys for Bob and it's kind of majority designers. It's really nice story. And, I think we'd love to go on for more, but we've got a limited time period.
We usually wrap up with what are you up to these days, but you mentioned you've retired, so living the dream, I'm hoping.
Yeah, I've got a couple of grandkids, and
Perfect.
I get to play with my electronics hobbies and kick a soccer ball around, and it's not bad. Yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah.
Perfect, absolutely awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really enjoyed this.
All right, welcome guys. Cheers. Thanks for having me.